Oh. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another webinar by MUNers Across Borders. It is my absolute pleasure to be talking today. My name is Philippe Lefebvre, the founder and director of MUNers Across Borders, an NGO designed to bring MUN closer together, to foster connections between the UN and MUN, and to establish a World Model UN Day to bring all MUNers and the UN system together. We're here today to discuss a very exciting development in the world of MUN and indeed UN relationship with youth and educational tools around the world. And that is the passing of the Model UN Resolution, which happened on the 1st of September this year at the 99th plenary meeting. And we have many of the key people involved in the negotiations and in the discussions around this with us today to discuss what does this mean for Model UN? Indeed, is this just one small step for the UN, but one giant leap for Model UN? Now, the panel here, as I said, is from a broad area across this, and I'm really, really happy to be joined by four amazing speakers. So just to introduce them to begin with, and then give it to them for some short opening remarks. After these, we'll have a few questions from myself as a moderator, but then we are very, very keen on hearing more from you. So please make sure to put your questions in the meeting chat, and you'll have the chance to ask them later. We will be recording this, so keep that in mind. And this is not subject to the Chatham House rule, but then again, this is MUN, so I'm not expecting it to be necessarily too 5 minutes. So to start with the introductions, I just want to quickly introduce Vitorino Oliveira, who is a diplomat and assistant professor and a Portuguese diplomat at the United Nations. He is a former diplomatic advisor to the Portuguese Minister of State and Finance and president of the Eurogroup. He's also a PhD candidate in economics of finance and assistant professor of sustainable international business, geoeconomics and international relations at the Nova School of Business and Economics, with research and teaching projects in other institutions. We also have joining with us Mr. William Yotiv, who is the current Model UN coordinator for the World Federation of UN Associations, a close friend of ours at MUN Resolution Borders, where he's responsible for planning WFUNA's Model UN conferences all around the world and developing educational materials and curricula for Model UN training purposes. He's been working on a range of projects, both with the International Labour Organization at the moment on how to accurately simulate the International Labour Conference, and has worked with the WHO to develop the first ever global model WHO, which will be an annual event alongside at the WHO headquarters. And his UN guide, if you read closely in the MUN resolution, was indeed cited in the resolution Model UN, and we're very happy to have him speak here today, where he's been an essential part of the making of the resolution. We have Mr. Maha Nasser, who has worked over 35 years in the UN system, during which time he's worked all over, both in Gaza, Jerusalem, Amman, Vienna, Cairo, and indeed New York. He's currently the Director of Outreach in the UN Department of Global Communications, and in his current position, his department leads the engagement in civil society, academia, sports, football, and the creative community. We're very happy to have him here today. And last but by certainly no means least, we have Farah Salim Ek, who is the Senior Director of Programs and Policies of the UN Association of the United States of America, UNA USA. And within this role, she oversees UNA USA's national programs, chapter support, communication, and membership engagement of one of the biggest, if I'm not wrong, UNA associations in the world. She brings 7+ years of experience as a volunteer and serving as chapter president and board member. So this fantastic panel is here to answer a whole range of questions about the Model UN resolution. What does it mean for the UN system, firstly, with the changes and how the new ASG for Youth is going to bring, the evolution of the Secretary General's envoys for youth position, and what are the changes going to mean for MUN? And for that, we have both someone from the United Nations Association and indeed also from WFUNA. And joining us, of course, many of you on this call are going to be MUN enthusiasts or addicts as myself, and we're very pleased to host you all today. With that being said, I will go straight away to our first speaker, Vitorino. Thank you very much for joining us. And please, the floor is indeed yours.
Thank you very much, Philippe, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the interest and the commitment towards Model United Nations. It's indeed a great pleasure to be in this call, in this event, and to share a bit of the experience with the resolution on Model UN, but also the follow-up and what we can do after that. So it's great to celebrate achievements, and it's even better to dream bigger and higher, and think what we can still do to support Model United Nations around the world. So as you've mentioned, we were able to adopt last 1st September the first ever GA resolution, so a resolution from the General Assembly on Model United Nations. It was adopted by consensus. It was adopted with 115 co-sponsors. It was one of the highest number of co-sponsors in the last session, which is a source of pride, of course. And it shows the consensual, relatively consensual nature of the topic, which was being discussed in its individual nature for the first time as such. So there was a text just on Model United Nations. And normally when we introduce a topic that is new, that is different, that is not often discussed in the General Assembly, it's more difficult to discuss it, to define what we mean. And indeed, so let me start with the beginning. Of course, I need to thank William Yotiv and the World Federation of UN Associations for the enthusiasm, the initiative to trigger that discussion on Model UN amongst member states. So that was instrumental, fundamental. What we needed to do in the beginning was to try to find a core group of interested countries that could lead these efforts. To draft a resolution is not as easy as it may seem, and to find time in an agenda that is very busy in the United Nations with 300, sometimes 400 resolutions, to introduce a new one is never easy. So we tried to find a core group of countries that would share an interest for Model United Nations, and the understanding that it is important to recognize MUN, and to have a discussion also amongst member states on what thousands, hundreds of thousands, I may say, of youth, and not necessarily youth, so people around the world, do in terms of simulating negotiations of the UN and showing interest for multilateralism. And so this group of core countries was composed by the Dominican Republic, Egypt, Jamaica, Laos, and Portugal. We built on negotiations that we had on youth affairs, but not only. And we took the opportunity that we were having very long discussions on the establishment of the youth office in the UN, on the youth pillar of our common agenda, which is the vision of the Secretary General for his second mandate, on the Summit of the Future, because there is a strong emphasis on youth specifically and the engagement of youth. And so we tried to build on top of these discussions and have a resolution. And this resolution sought to address different issues. So one of the preliminary principles that we had to define amongst ourselves was, okay, so we want a resolution that is short, because we all are focused in many topics. We want a resolution that recognizes the importance of Model United Nations, and that's fundamental, that's the key of the resolution. But we also want a resolution that tries to map a little bit the role of different stakeholders, so member states, the UN system, civil society, so the UN Secretariat, and so on. So how can all of these actors have a role to support Model UN? What is already being done? So that was important, because we're not starting from scratch. You all know that. We've been doing Model United Nations since decades. Bill will probably talk a bit about that, but it's been many, many years indeed. So it was about recognizing what existed, but also trying to provide some reasoning on what can still be done. As much as possible, codify that. If not possible to codify, at least raise awareness and have member states discussing what is important. And at the same time, one key principle that we had to set in the beginning was we do not want a budgetary implication from this resolution, at least not as of now. So we didn't want to create an initiative that would have a cost, that would make our life easier, especially for one first resolution entirely devoted on Model UN that we wanted to be adopted by consensus and with the widest possible number of co-sponsors. So these were the principles, and we were indeed able to recognize the importance of Model UN for multilateralism, for diplomacy, for international cooperation, to encourage the support of member states, of the UN system, the Secretariat, civil society, to focus specifically or emphasize the importance of youth and the engagement of youth for Model UN. That was important as well, to recognize what the Secretariat was already doing, and namely the guide. There is a guide that is available, and to call for the translation of that guide. And Portugal also already funded the translation to Portuguese, for instance. So we did our part. We encourage all our colleagues to translate it in as many languages as possible. There was also the proposal or the idea during the negotiations to create an international day for Model UN. That proposal was discussed with some detail. There is, however, an understanding from many member states, the principal understanding that we do not support the proliferation of international days. Every year there are many proposals for international days. But so what we tried to do as facilitators of this negotiation was to find a way to have one day as well for Model UNs to be particularly discussed at length, or to raise awareness about Model UN. And we decided to underscore the importance of the UN Day, which is the 24th of October. There's no better day than that one to recognize the value of initiatives related to the UN, such as Model UN. And we also wanted to recognize in the resolution the importance of the Youth Office, which is still being created. There is already an Assistant Secretary General, so a chief of the office. It's an Uruguayan young person, Felipe Polier, and we are going to follow up with him and his new office on new initiatives. And so I would like to conclude with two main ideas. One is, so the level of co-sponsorships was relatively high, but it was not uniform, in the sense that there were regions of the world where we couldn't steer support, as much support as we wanted, and interest to have specific countries sponsoring the resolution. And for instance, so we were able to have a very large number of supporters amongst WEOG members, amongst Eastern European countries, which was actually the largest group supporting, but also if we want to see other groupings, for instance, the SEEDs mobilized very strongly to support Model UN, and in Asia Pacific as well. We expected more support from the African group, for instance, and we weren't able to raise awareness or raise interest during the negotiations as much as we wanted. But that also, I'm highlighting this because that shows that the Model UN culture, despite being widespread around the world, it's still predominantly seen as an agenda from some specific groups. And that was a narrative that we had to fight during the negotiations, because this is not something from the EU, this is not something from the US and the UK or Canada, this is something that is important for everyone around the world. So we had language, for instance, on developing countries, particularly strong in this negotiation. And of course, the ultimate goal is to spread as much as possible this culture around the world, with the understanding that there are countries or organizations that have a footprint that is stronger in some specific universities, in some specific societies, and so on. So that's one of the ideas that I wanted to raise. The second one is to discuss a bit, and I know I'm getting to the end of my allotted time slot, to discuss a bit what are the follow-up initiatives that we want to have after that. So it's very important to have the recognition of Model UN, first time ever. That's indeed historic. What can we still do? So this is about what I'm talking on behalf of member states, or at least on Portugal, on the Portuguese side. What we want to do is to try to continue promoting the culture of Model UN and spread it to more countries. And we are ready to do that, not only with the translation of the guide that the UN Secretariat has produced. And of course, that's a very, very relevant resource. And I have to thank, of course, Maher and Bill as well for their efforts in this regard. We want to look in more detail about how we can capacitate better organizations around the world to organize Model UN beyond the guide, whether there are initiatives that we can support, and we would be ready to do that. We want to work on finding ways to building this network of practitioners of Model UN. So there are different organizations around the world, MUNers Across Borders, the World Federation of UN Associations, and many others that are working on bridging, connecting people. We want to try to work on that in that area as well. To be able to clarify to these all of these students organizations around the world how they can reach out to missions if they need support, how they can reach out to a secretariat or the UN system for speakers or for support in their different initiatives. We want to be able to showcase good practices of Model UNs and organize more side events and perhaps on the UN Day, so on the 21st of October, but also beyond that specific date. We want to clarify specific hurdles that that we've been receiving from organizations, meaning on the use of the logo or the branding of the UN, different things that they are very specific, very small, but sometimes create barriers for some organizations to understand what they can do or they cannot do, and that creates disincentives sometimes for some initiatives. And we want to help this clarification. We want to continue to support having Model UNs being brought at the highest possible level within member states and the UN system. So we, of course, acknowledge that the DSG has been publishing messages on Model UNs every day. Every day would be too much, but every year. that's really good. But we want to bring this specific initiative to our statements and our speeches and our initiatives as member states as well. And one of the preliminary areas where we are looking at is, of course, the Summit of the Future, where we have a full chapter devoted to youth and future generations, but youth and the engagement of youth. So we want to crystallize or try to crystallize that in a pact for the future, which is important. But there are other initiatives, for instance, related to town halls of youth, with different indicators to measure youth participation in different political systems or in multilateralism. There's many ideas around on top of the tables to discuss that can be linked to Model UN. And we want to bring it and consistently raising ambition to spreading this culture that is important for us around the world. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. No, there's a lot of points you hit there, and I really want to thank you again for all your work on the Model UN Summit, and also mentioning a lot about the Summit for the Future, which we'll be focusing on at the MUN Summit next year in March, and of course the impetus for it, which we're really happy to see. I want to give it over to Maher next. Obviously, the UN Department of Global Communications is a really key player here, not just engaging with Model UN, but associations, youth, a whole range of institutions that mean a lot. So over to you for the remarks, and what would you like to see really out of some of these initiatives? How would you like to see MUN help really in this case the UN system, or the other way around too? Please, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Philip, and good to see all participants, and thanks Vitorino, and congratulations to you and the Mission of Portugal and all the supporting co-sponsors for the resolution. It's something that we have not seen in the past, and I think it's always welcome from our perspective. Personally, I have never participated in a Model UN as a student. I grew up in Ramallah in Palestine. At the time, I went to schools run by the UN for Palestine refugees. And the last thing that might come to your mind is the Model United Nations. So that maybe sometimes it depends on where and how you grow up and what are the issues that people will be looking at and for. And that's why maybe Model UN started in the West, in the young countries, and little by little they're growing separately. My first interaction with the Model UN directly was when I joined the department, actually, as director of UN Information Center in Cairo. A group of students who had been participating in Model UN in other parts in Egypt, but also outside, wanted to organize the first ever Model UN in Arabic at their university in Cairo, Ain Shams University. But the university was not convinced. So I actually went and I met with the president of the university and I met with other colleagues in the professors and convinced them. And that was my first engagement with a Model UN in taking part, speaking at it, encourage them to continue with it. And I saw the value of those simulations, not only in a way of growing capacity to engage with others and dialogue and debating skills, but also they had to do research. They had to look at what could be this government's or this member state's position on this issue. So they would have to read about it. They will have to also, maybe it also teaches a little bit of taking the view of others. If you're coming from one country and you want to represent another, you might start to see things from the other perspective. As I came to New York to assume this job, that's when I met Bill. And the department had launched its own global Model United Nations that was organized by the department. And we managed the one in Korea in 2011. And again, it was fascinating to see 350, 400 young people coming together, engaging. At that point, I saw that our engagement as a department, our work is actually to ensure that what happens in the building is reverberated outside, that we inform, but also we plant seeds of change in accordance with what member states wants to see, whether it's at the time the MDGs and subsequently the SDGs, but also the 3 pillars: human rights, peace and security, and sustainable development. And Model UNs were seen as a tool, but for us as a department to actually organize one simulation, when we know that there are hundreds taking place every year around the world, it doesn't make sense. We're putting a drop in the bucket, actually a drop in the ocean. But what we did know is that the simulations that were actually happening around the world were not really simulating the United Nations. They were all based on the parliamentary rules of procedure, following the big models like the Harvard model, and focusing more on debate skills rather than on empathy or research. And also, they were not catching up with the growth and development in how resolutions are adopted in the United Nations and the value of consensus. And I think this is something where there was a big departure from the real UN. From the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, and this is something that actually Bill did in collaboration with other colleagues, they did a review of the number of resolutions adopted by the General Assembly. And it turned out that the majority of resolutions, with the exception of a couple of committees, were adopted by consensus. And when you adopt a resolution and negotiate for a resolution to be adopted by consensus, then your proposition and your approach is totally different. And I think that is also something that we wanted Model UNs to start working towards, encouraging the participants to seek solutions that will arrive at resolutions that will be adopted by consensus, which means win-win, not win-lose. If 51 vote a resolution, the 49 others or 30 others % do not feel invested in the resolution and they don't feel it is their resolution. And I think that takes away from the value of multilateralism that brings in everybody under the same tent, under the same umbrella. So That was the value of what we took from the simulations that we organized. And then we started to organize workshops to people like yourself, Philip. What do you call yourself? An addicted MUNer or an MUN enthusiast? Okay, you want to come and learn how to properly simulate UN? Come to our workshops. So we organized a couple of those, one in Vienna and a couple here in New York. And my ambition at the time, and I worked with Bill on that, how do we put this resource as a value on a website? So we put everything on the website, and subsequently, after many, many years, we managed to publish the Model UN and the manual, basically the book, which was first published in English, and it came out during COVID. So we didn't really get a chance to push it out or to organize an event in the UN bookshop, which was what we do when we have a new book. And we did that eventually when the French version came out. And of course, thanks to the Portuguese ministry, we have a Portuguese version. We are now working as also asked by resolution, but also as per our priority, which is to communicate in all the languages possible. We want this model to be available, this book to be available in as many languages as possible. And people would ask, well, why UN? Why do we have a UN? I mean, we will be 80 years old in 2025. But if you look around the world, and people will say, look, there are all these problems that are happening, and the UN hasn't stopped them. Imagine for a minute, take out the UN and tell me what scale of 1 to 100 all of these problems, from climate crisis, the impact of COVID and carry over from that, the conflicts, the displacement, the rising hunger, poverty, rising inequalities, where would we be on that if there wasn't a multilateral process and a United Nations? It is, I think, clear to us, when member states agree together, we succeed on anything. If there are differences, we do not. And that goes back to the value of consensus. And how do we work and negotiate to create a way forward that is leading us forward? Is everything working? Not necessarily perfectly. It is working to some extent. And that's why when the 75th anniversary concluded with the survey and listening exercise, the Secretary General was asked by member states to come up with proposals to really improve the way we are doing things as an organization, as a system. And that's the history of our common agenda. So our common agenda was a response presented by the SG to member states on looking forward. And that included 4 summits. 2 of them have taken place. Transforming Education Summit, because education is key on everything. And Model UNs are a process of education. The SDG Summit, which we had here in September, Summit of the Future, and then the Social Summit in 2025. Now, for the Summit of the Future, and I think many of the issues that we talk about and we say that are imperfect in the UN, that is a golden opportunity for member states to actually address those issues. And the 5 chapters that are going to be in the Pact for the Future touch on those things, including the governance issue, the financing for development, youth, technology, innovation, peace and security. So all of these issues are going to be in the Summit of the Future. So all the simulations in 2024, if I was to tell MUNers, what should you focus on? Simulate the Summit of the Future. Start thinking about Summit of the Future. There will be a 0 draft of the Pact of the Future coming out in January, maybe February. Work with that and then see where you can go and address those issues directly. We are organizing, and to also ensure from our part as a department, we will continue to engage with Model UNs as we do. We are actually in the process of updating the Secretary General's message to Model UN that Vitorino mentioned. So the new text will be, and the video message will be coming out in the next few weeks. But for the Summit of the Future, we have started preparing for a conference for civil society. And we have engaged with Wafuna and UN associations because we want this conference in May, 9 and 10 May in Nairobi, to be the platform where young people, we are also going to be working with Dr. Philippe Poulier, the new ASG for Youth Affairs, to bring their perspective and feedback to member states. We're working with the co-facilitators, with the Office of the President of the Challenge. So this conference in Nairobi, mark your calendars if you want to come. Registration should be hopefully started soon. But that is something that, again, it's concrete. It's not a simulation, but it is an opportunity for people who are engaged with Model UN, young people, civil society organizations, to also come to Nairobi and maybe do a simulation on the side. I don't know. But that's something that I think really we see value in it, because we expect that once the Summit Pact of the Future, in the same way that the SDGs were seen as legitimate, because they started with a process that tapped into 10 million people, tapped into civil society. All of the contributions through the World We Want survey were taken into account when member states and world leaders adopted the SDGs. So for the Pact for the Future to get the same level of legitimacy and support, that's why we're trying to reach out and get them involved. We are looking, again, like I said, we have the book, the Model UN, the Guide to Model UN in 3 languages now. We have been asked by member states to work through existing resources to translate it to the other 3 official languages, and we are going to definitely do that as much as possible. We're also engaging with, I think there is going to be a Korean version of the Guide to Model UN that an NGO is helping us translate, and hopefully more and more languages through our UN information centers. I think this is something that we believe in as a value. To reach people, we have to reach them in the languages that they know and they appreciate. And not every Model UN needs to be done in English. I think this is a challenge. We shouldn't only just thinking about English. And the resolution now actually gives us tools to work to encourage other engagement with member states on the MUN. And I think I'm really keen to hear more from the other participants about how we can develop this, build on the resolution, build on the enthusiasm. COVID did a terrible job in stopping people coming together. Now that we are moving beyond COVID, I think we have to see how we can get back into working with Model UNs in person, but also virtually. So looking forward to hearing all of you and to continue working together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maher. And I hope you're pleased to know at least that whilst it was not around in your time when you were growing up, Palestine MUN is in its 12th edition. So it is spreading across the world. And thank you very much for your words on what it means to the UN system. And indeed, we really hope to work as closely as possible with the Pact for the Future and indeed the Summit for the Future. I'd like to move to Farah next. So obviously you consider yourself a world citizen. You've been working all over the world. Model UN clearly speaks to something both in you personally and in the work of UNA USA. So I'd like to give you the floor for any opening remarks on why the resolution is important to you. What do you think you'd like to see come out of it? And indeed, what changes might need to be made to the UN or in MUN itself?
Yes, thank you so much, Philippe, and to everyone who helped to make this resolution a possibility and come to fruition. It's an incredible moment. And so let's continue to extend this enthusiasm. But I did want to start by saying I'm in particular very thrilled to be here to not only represent UNA USA as a staff person, but as someone who has, as you mentioned in my brief bio, Philippe, as a volunteer with UNA USA. So for more than 7 years, I was a volunteer, I was a chapter leader in Chicago, and I bring this up because I was that average person that didn't necessarily work with the UN, I was very UN adjacent, etc. But during that time, and of course now in my position as a staff person with UNA USA, I've been able to meet hundreds of MUNers and to support Model UN related initiatives. But like Maher, I myself never had the chance to participate as a delegate. in high school or university. There were opportunities, but I chose other paths, if you will. But I think that my life experience very much lends itself to serving as a diplomat as I moved to a new country every 3 years with my father's position. And I was fortunate enough to get close to Model UN in terms of when I was based in Nairobi, I served as a featured speaker for the African Model UN. And that really helped to inspire me. This was, after I had graduated university, I was living and working in Nairobi. And it was there that it really hit me. I've always been a UN supporter, which is, of course, why I joined UNA USA as a volunteer. But there I was able to see that there were haves and have-nots. So like me, I chose not necessarily to participate in Model UN, but I also, when I was living in Nairobi, I met a lot of young people in particular, and not only young people, but seasoned people who were not able to participate in Model UN simulations for one reason or another. And that has really stuck with me after I've, moved back to the US. And then when I resumed my position as president of UNA Chicago, one way that I found that it was a really meaningful way to address this gap, this disparity, if you will, of experience, was to introduce, and I wasn't the first, I can't take credit, there were a couple of other UNA chapters in the US who had started this, but to start intergenerational Model UNs. So not only focusing on young people, but looking at people of all backgrounds, all experience levels, including those, who I, more seasoned in the gray hair area, et cetera, who didn't have a chance to participate in Model UN. And just a little bit of an aside related to intergenerational Model UN, this was, again, open to anyone of any age, any experience, including and especially for people who had never participated in any kind of educational settings, but they wanted to participate and to discuss and to engage in topics or issues that were really important to them. And so I'll come back to this idea of intergenerational Model UN, but I would be remiss if I didn't squeeze in a few mentions of the intertwined history of WFUNA, the World Federation of UNAs, which Bill is representing today, Model UN, and then UNA USA, so the UNA Association for the US. I know so many acronyms, I'm very sorry. But the League of Nations Association was a national organization that was based in the US, had similar semi-autonomous branches throughout the country, and then started a network of model assemblies throughout the US. And this was around 1925. So then when LNA changed its name around 1945, this became the American Association for the United Nations, and this was under First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And then from there, it shifted from being the primary force behind model assemblies to being kind of the primary force between for a collegiate network of model UNs. And then in 1965, AAUN merged with the U.S. Committee for the United Nations. And then the rest is history. That we assumed the name UNA USA, which of course is part of WFUNA. And I wanted to give you a brief history because there is such an interconnection, of course, with our particular UNA. And I will say that we're working really hard to try to come back to that focus of Model UN, but perhaps also while addressing UNA's commitment to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. So that's, the lens through which we are approaching all of our programs and all of our policies. And so, today I very much recognize and celebrate that the resolution uplifts, especially building capacities of young people. And again, I keep mentioning young people. UNA USA is more than 65% of our membership is under the age of 26. That's over 16,000 Americans and US residents. So obviously youth activism is indeed very important to us. So I'm not pushing that to the side, but I do find that the next meaningful step after this resolution is to democratize opportunities to access Model UN. So again, that's not being limited to those who are already currently enrolled in university or secondary schools, et cetera. And so, as I was thinking about today, I'm a bicultural woman of color who has lived and worked in more than 31 countries. And so, of course, I know firsthand the impact of diplomacy, not only as a young person, but eventually as a mid-career professional. And I don't need to tell everyone on this webinar that the real world, of course, is very diverse. And so that's why I believe that after recognizing the importance of Model UN, which this resolution has done, the next most important step is to diversify and democratize. So, thinking about some questions, does this simulation represent or reflect the real world? Or, how can we ensure that people who have never had a chance to be a delegate, to be able to sit and to serve as a delegate? And so I have, and there are some other organizations and other movements I know, and you all probably know much better than me, but when thinking about how we would like to see MUN take the next step and to diversify, first of all, looking at outreach and recruitment. So promoting to a wide range of students, especially underrepresented communities. Diversity can mean a lot of things, but for us at UNA USA, we're really trying to dig into access to, Native American Indian reservation schools, to historically Black colleges and universities, those universities or high schools that are in predominantly Hispanic communities. So looking at outreach and recruitment, that's how you start. Of course, and I think this may have been mentioned, it's financial accessibility. So how do we address the financial barrier? It costs a lot to participate in most conferences, simulations, et cetera. So how do we address that? This has been mentioned, but I will say I want to highlight the idea of having culturally inclusive topics. So not only coming together, but coming together and talking about, and having agendas that are inclusive, relevant to the diverse range of participants, so that they are able to feel a connection and engagement with the issues. Of course, training and mentorship, you all are the experts on that, but I think mentorship is so key, and could have no cost except the cost of time and sharing talent. Language accessibility, I know Mahard spoke a lot about this, especially as it relates to the guide, but just thinking about what is the language level, not only just the actual language, but the language level, and not to make assumptions, in particular when people are congregating as it relates to language. This goes without saying, but inclusive environment. So making sure that beyond a statement in a booklet or what have you, that there's really truly an embodiment of open dialogue, understanding. And I think unfortunately in our day and age, being able to understand the term safe space is a safe space to explore ideas, to have discussion, et cetera. Obviously, diversity doesn't start and stop with just the delegates, but I think starting with leadership, who are the organizers of such a convening? Try to find people who could be mentored even while they are, putting together such a conference or gathering. And then partnerships and collaborations. This is, of course, where organizations like UNA USA comes in. But so, not necessarily only looking to the Harvards or what have you, but looking to other institutions or community groups that serve underrepresented people. And then I come back to flexible formats, and that's something that I'm particularly passionate about given the intergenerational Model UN format, which UNA USA did host a virtual national intergenerational Model UN. And talk about diversity. It was a very diverse group. And so thinking through not only flexible format in terms of, is it offered virtually, is it offered in person, but just could it be shortened? Could it be a bite-sized appetizer, if you will, because again, that would reduce costs and financial inaccessibility. And so these are just some ideas, coming to the table that I hoped we could discuss, or that we're thinking about from a UNA USA standpoint, to really try to be intentional, to incorporate these strategies into our programming. Not necessarily that we will host, a Model UN conference beyond intergenerational Model UN. But really, again, it's just for us, it just makes sense as the next step. So I'm really appreciative for the invitation to participate in this discussion, and looking forward to additional questions and comments.
Well, Farah, thank you so much, especially on, I think, some of the detailed, you're right, questions we have to answer. We're all very happy with this first stage, which is a big stage. I mean, it's the first time we've recognized MUN since it started 80 years ago. But I would definitely like to pick up on some of those items of inclusivity when we do go through a few more of the questions later. Lastly, Bill, I mean, your name has been dropped several times in this webinar, and indeed once more, thank you very much for joining us today. For those listening, Bill and I have been talking for well over 2 years now on Model UN religiously, on its impact, what it means to us, and I'm very happy to invite him to the webinar today. So please, over to you. Where to begin, really, but more importantly, what does this mean for the community, do you think, and what does this mean for the UN?
Thank you very much, Philippe, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and very exciting at the same time to be here talking about this resolution, which took decades to be adopted in the GA. I'm very passionate about Model UN. My involvement with it started in 1970. I participated in my very first Model UN called the East Coast Model UN. It connected students all over the East Coast that came to my high school in 1970. And so I've been with this for many, many decades now. But back as a sophomore in high school, I never would have dreamed that I'd be sitting here with all of you talking about this, that there would be a GA resolution adopted on this topic. If we focus on what will change as a result of this resolution, I think that we need to start with the realization that although the number of Model UNs grow, my screen changed. Although the number of Model UNs continue to grow, the coverage in the media is increasingly declining. I think many of you know that I've been working on writing a book about the history of Model UN, and I found that the mentions of Model UN in the media peaked in 1963. There were an amazing 699,610 articles published on Model UN conferences just in 1963 alone. It's amazing, right? Today, in 2023, we now have 36,502. So it went from basically 700,000 in 1963, and every year it's been going down, 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 till now a little less than 37,000. So there's been a loss of interest in the media, although if you're in the Model UN community, this is something which actually is growing in popularity instead of declining. And if we look at UN documents themselves, the talking about youth and the importance of youth, it's one of the main priorities of the UN and has been increasing in its importance. I've gone through many of the UN documents coming out of the UN Secretariat, and not one of them mentions Model UN. In the most recent, our common agenda that's come out, it talks about the importance of youth participation in decision-making, which is expanded and strengthened through dedicated national youth consultative bodies, a global standard for meaningful youth engagement, a framework to track progress, avenues, all sorts of things, no mention of Model UN. So I think we're starting from a baseline of 0, and I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I was very happy to hear Vitorino talk about the fact that he sees going forward that the importance of including Model UN in statements of member states, but I think also there needs to be more coming out of the UN Secretariat when they're talking about youth participation, that Model UN needs to be in there somewhere. There was no coverage of the adoption of this resolution. We considered it historic from the Model UN perspective. But within the UN system, there was a very brief mention in meetings and coverage that had one brief sentence that said a resolution on Model UN was adopted. End of story. There was a summary of the comments made by the permanent representative of Portugal after it was adopted, but there was just one brief sentence that was mentioned in the meetings and coverage and nowhere else. There have been no mentions of Model UNs at all that happen regularly at the UN. And I think that's one area that we need to change, raising the visibility of Model UN within the UN itself. Because when we get to the recommendations in the resolution itself, which I will focus on now, many of these resolutions, many of the recommendations in this resolution need much more support if they're ever going to be realized. So if we get to encourages member states to support the organization of Model United Nations, this is not going to happen by itself. We need to think and be creative of ideas of how can we support member states in supporting Model UN. We need to think of that. I think as a kind of model, when Switzerland had the presidency of the General Assembly, they came out with this wonderful handbook on the General Assembly, which I still use to this day as a reference. Maybe we need something like that for member states to consult, to help support them in supporting Model UN. Then we get to another operative paragraph, encourages the UN system to support Model UN programs as appropriate through the sharing of information and capacity building. These are very vague terms. Sharing information is a very broad term, covers a lot of ground. And I only think of one area in particular that's really impacted the Model UNs that we organize, is we used to have something called Paper Smart, where you could easily find statements made by member states at many, many different meetings on many, many different agenda items. It was very easy to find them. And that, for budgetary reasons, of course, was stopped a number of years ago. But now it's very difficult for students to find this information. You can find it, there are videos. It takes a lot of work. It was much easier when we had Paper Smart. We need to bring this back. If we're really going to support Model UN, we need to talk about how we can make this information more easily accessible to Model UNs, because I can tell you, it really impacts the quality of the Model UN's discussion when they can access the positions that real ambassadors and countries have taken on the issues that they're debating. Then we get to something which is brought up before, which is something that I consider really critical: promoting equal opportunities for all to access Model United Nations programs. We know the SDGs is about social inclusion, about the inequalities. Just as we talk about a digital divide, we have a divide between the global north and the global south in access to Model UN for reasons that Farah brought up. The financial costs. When we organized the Model UN in 2009, the very first one in the Palais des Nations, we had a huge interest of students from Africa who could not come. We were able to support participation of students from Africa because our Undersecretary General at the time was generous enough to use a part of the budget of the UN to finance their travel to Geneva. But this was the only way that was possible for them to even participate. So we need to really focus. And it's interesting, Vitorino, when you talked about how which region of the world were less likely to sponsor the resolution. We need to do more in Africa. We need to be speaking more to member states there to make it clear that there is a great desire in Africa to participate in Model UN, a great desire. I can't tell you, every time we do a Model UN, we get a lot of students from Africa that register that end up not coming because they can't afford it. So we really, really need to come together and focus. We've come up with some ideas. Some of the ideas we have is to turn to universities and high schools who have more financial means to sponsor students from the Global South. And some of them have been able to do it, but not on the scale that we need. We need to really scale up the support to be able to make the access to students from the Global South. This is a critical thing that we need to come together and figure out how we can do this. And I think, Vitorino, we need to work more in getting the support of member states and to get them to see how important this is. Encouraging civil society and other relevant stakeholders to organize and participate in Model UN. Well, I think a part of this is we need to have better data about Model UN to identify places where Model UN is needed the most. A couple of years ago, I did a survey, and I found that there was at least one Model UN organized in 141 countries. So many countries only had one or a small number of Model UNs, and there's a minority of countries that have many Model UNs. As we've talked about, China is huge, India is huge, Europe is big, the United States is big. But these are larger countries, and it makes sense why they would have a more vibrant Model UN participation. But there are many countries that only have one or a few Model UNs, and then many more that don't have any. So we need to figure out and have better data on where do we need to focus our attention and energy if we're going to expand Model UN and use this resolution as a means to do so. So what we would like to see as a result of this resolution is an increase in the number of programs, but we have many challenges and obstacles to do that. And we need to have a closer alignment with the UN agenda, and this has been addressed in a couple of the recommendations. So, for instance, having the president-elect of the General Assembly suggest an issue, which member states will be invited to invite to comment on during the general debate, and encourage each organizations to consider these themes when organizing Model UNs, and then the idea of using UN Day on October 24th. These are very concrete, actionable things that we know we can do that are relatively easy. The other recommendations are going to be harder because the way they're very vague, they're very broad, and we need to really figure out how we can actually implement them. So, sorry, again, my screen changed. Sorry about that. Okay. And how I'd like to see it change so that Model UN will be more impactful and educational. Now, I'll end here. I think what we'd like to see is more of a spillover from the engagement in simulations to support in the achievement of the SDGs through a personal shift in people's behavior toward more responsible consumption, whether that's through reduction in waste or other lifestyle changes that are more in harmony with nature, and the development and implementation of community projects. Students who participate in Model UN bring a particular enthusiasm and engagement in global issues. And we're starting to see in Model UN programs that there's a real desire to then go back into the communities and bring this interest and enthusiasm to be change makers into their communities. So you have programs like MUN Impact that look at how can you take this energy from Model UN and start developing and implement programs. We've started a program within our conferences called Act for Impact, where we train students to develop and implement projects in their communities related to the SDGs. This is how I would like to see, and it's already happening, but I'd like to see it on a larger scale, where Model UNs go beyond just Model UN, beyond simulations, and focus on how can they bring their enthusiasm, interest in global issues into their community to make positive change. And I will end there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. Honestly, all of you have brought some really amazing sides to this debate, and I want to really thank you all for taking also a unique aspect to it. I want to start, well, firstly by saying to everyone, if you do have questions for the panel, please feel free to raise your hand and ask them yourself, or feel free to put them in the chat too. But I do want to start very much on a topic that I think has really come to the forehand here, and that is inclusivity. You know, how can we make sure that MUN is more inclusive, both in terms of how which countries really get involved, and also in terms of the individuals within the MUN. I mean, anecdotally, I've been trying to set up a conference in Uganda, but necessarily also the country itself's opinion and reflection on the way the UN talks to it has been one of the main blocking points. So it's not just necessarily about, you know, individuals or societies, also sometimes governmentally challenging. So the question I'm going to posit to each of you is quite simple. I would like to ask you each, what is one thing that the average MUNer or average engaged citizen can do to make Model UN more inclusive? And what is one thing that your organization can do to make Model UN more inclusive and bring it to further countries? Because it's not just about others, I would say. It's also about what each of our own organizations, and the real, I would say, star of having all four of you here is you do all look at different perspectives. So once again, that's just sort of one thing that you think the average Model UN individual can do to make MUN more inclusive, whether they be organizers, whether they be delegates, whether they even just be someone who likes the term Model UN. And one specific thing that you think your organization can / is doing, will be doing, to make Model UN more inclusive, either that grassroots perspective or that more global perspective. And I'll reverse the order here. So sorry, Vitorino, it's going to be a while since you get to speak again from the reverse aspect. But just those two items. And then I'm hoping by then we'll also have a few more questions from the floor. That's the only question I'll ask because we run a little bit over time there. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise. So Bill, back to you there. I'm going to continue on with your words, which have been really, really good. So yeah, what's one thing you think we can do and one thing that you can do?
Well, I think perhaps again, one idea is to come up with some recommendations and best practices that we can share with Model UNs around the world about how they can make their programs more inclusive and diverse. One of the things that again going back to this, I think one of the barriers is the financial issue. Mm-hmm. One of the best Model UN programs that I was involved with when I was at the UN was a program that came out of South Africa, where they came up with this idea of twinning schools that came from higher income areas of South Africa with areas that were low income areas. And they built Model UN teams so that half of the team came from a school that was disadvantaged and the other half came from a team that came from a higher income part of the country. And then they would travel to the United States as teams, not as separate, as teams, inclusive teams. And they won all kinds of awards when they would go to Model UN conferences. So this idea of twinning is something that I think that we need to explore more, and that Model UNs around the world is something that we're using in our conferences as well. That's the idea that I told you about, of getting schools that have the ability to sponsor students from the global South that don't have the ability to do so. I think that's one general practice, best practice that I think that we could share with other Model UNs and encourage them to do the same so that their Model UNs are more diverse. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure others here have other ideas to it. But the general idea, it's what we are doing in our conferences, but the general idea, I think, is perhaps if we could have a conversation about best practices and then share that with Model UNs around the world to help them make their programs more diverse.
Thank you so much, Bill.
And inclusive.
Of course. Laura, over to you. So similar question, what's something that anyone can do and one thing that you would like to do?
Yeah, and of course I represent the grassroots perspective. So, what is something that an MUN addict, as you so called, you self-identify, Philippe, I will say that what has been helpful, especially for someone who did not participate in MUN, but I've actually organized conferences, has been that of train the trainer. So providing your expertise, not only with other potential or prospective delegates, but also with people who are trying to coordinate the conference. I mean, that's immeasurable in terms of support. And to take that a bit further, in terms of what are we doing, or UNA, USA, or other organizations that are similar, I'll go back to this idea of the intergenerational Model UN, because I think that it helps to it helps to take away a few of the, or reduce, maybe not necessarily take away, but reduce some of those barriers. So when we talk about financial accessibility, we try to address that by, number one, having it as an all virtual conference. It was only one day, so if somebody had to take off work, it was only one day off work. Another aspect of just in terms of financial accessibility that may not necessarily seem explicit is that of the research. For the Intergenerational Model UN Conference, we had seasoned MUNers, and then actually some non, some people who were interested in the topical areas to conduct the research, because this would allow delegates who wouldn't necessarily otherwise maybe have that disposable free time to be able to research. They could feel like they would have access to resources for free, of course, to be able to participate, to be knowledgeable. So I think just kind of front loading resources, time, those are, and of course talent, that's where the treasure is. And for us, I think, again, it's not about winning awards. It's about, we are really, and I use this word very intentionally, democratizing opportunities beyond our members. It's really to communities and to global citizens outside of our usual network.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Maha, the same over to you. What would you like others to do? And is there anything that you're particularly keen on UN Global Department of Communication working on?
I think one has to recognize that there isn't the same environment in different countries or within even the same country. The example that Bill mentioned from South Africa, actually, one of our UN Information Center directors, Damien Cardona, when he was in Colombia, he actually worked with the city, Bogota, but also with neighboring municipalities, and they organized Model UN for the school system that included and brought together students from public schools and students from private schools, and did something similar to what Bill mentioned. And I don't speak Spanish. I took one course, but they asked for a message in Spanish. So I did it with the teleprompter, and I delivered my first Spanish address to that Model UN, which had something like 20,000 students participating, if not even more, in different schools and together. And I think these systems that, how can you ensure, to address Farah's point, which I think MUN is a privileged activity. I mean, it is so far, for the most part, has been a reserve of those who could afford to participate, afford in time and afford in money. And I one of the people I met in one of our MUN simulations and the workshop, actually, he was in his late 20s, and he told me that he had participated in 170 MUN. I mean, I couldn't even imagine the number. This guy has been going from one MUN to the next. What budget does he have, or what else is he doing in his life? So I think MUN participation is, I think there's a great pedagogical value in it. There's a great social value in it. There's a great value in it in developing and thinking. And I think this is where, when we talk about education, I think it's always, how do you see this as an opportunity to develop your critical thinking and also to find solutions that then you can share with others? How we can, I mean, I think as a department, as United Nations, what we will definitely continue to do is, whenever we are approached for expertise, experience, for the translation and availability of the guide to how to simulate UN, we will make that available more and more. We will also, and we have been encouraging our UN information centers, the resident coordinators, which are present in 132 countries, to also be willing to serve as resource people and to speak. Because many times Model UNs like to have somebody from the UN come and speak to them, because that actually raises the profile of the simulation. More people will want to go and participate, and to encourage them to go and speak, because, and they have often offered to, pay for people to participate. And I would say, no, we were not going to fly from New York to come to participate in the Model UN. You're in a country where we have a resident coordinator first of all, the carbon footprint, then let that resident coordinator come and we're happy to provide them with talking points. But I think that is something that is key. We will encourage our system colleagues to support when feasible, at least by speaking, but also sometimes engaging and talking about their actual lived experience. Now, model UNs, and the one thing that I would like to see develop is model UNs have been mainly a simulation of how the intergovernmental process takes place. And it stops at the adoption of resolutions. And I think maybe for the sake of critical thinking is to see simulations that would go beyond that and think about how would this be actually implemented? What would be the role of the Secretariat and Department in translating this resolution? And what difference would that be from the actual reality on the ground?
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Very good points there. Vitorino, so last but not least, please over to yourself, and maybe building on some of the points you've heard before. I'm going to reverse what Bill had to deal with after following everyone else, and now over to you. What is one thing that you would like to see all others do when it comes to making MUN more inclusive, and what is something that you think, and I'm having you speak on behalf of, 193 member states, but what do you think it is Portugal or member states, what they can do a bit more of?
Thank you. And it's actually very exciting to be here because I'm taking note of a lot of ideas as well. So that's great. But just to talk about inclusivity and give you specific examples of how difficult it is. During the negotiations that spanned for a few months, to be honest, you had negotiators, so diplomats in the room that had participated in Model UN, that had been speakers in Model UN, or that even had kids of their own participating in Model UN. And so for these, it was very easy to understand what Model UNs were, how they are organized, what's their value. They were at the same time in the same room, colleagues, diplomats, seasoned diplomats, young diplomats that had absolutely no idea of what the Model UN was and didn't understand the concept, didn't understand if it was something that governments organized to promote the United Nations in their own countries, whether it was NGOs, whether these NGOs had to be sanctioned by or authorized by the government or not, whether this was in high schools, schools, primary schools, universities. So there was a huge effort to understand what Model UNs are, the diversity of models that exist out there, and how it was still important to discuss this. To give you examples of what a country can do, like Portugal, what we do, we receive literally dozens of requests a year of different schools in Portugal, but also here in New York, that want to understand our views on a specific topic to participate in Model UNs. Some schools come here to the mission, we talk to them, they see how diplomats work in practice. We provide different tours to use that come to Portugal, to the UN headquarters and to the mission. We have multiple exchanges virtually and sending information or referring to statements that we make. We try to support all of these entities, from most of them from Portugal or from the US, because we are talking about the mission here in New York, but also from other countries. And sometimes we have colleagues that bring youth from their own countries, and we try to engage and have different initiatives. But one interesting thing is that so that's what Maher was also saying. Even within a specific country, there are many inequalities in terms of access. We have a lot of organizations, mostly from Lisbon, Porto, Braga, the main cities in Portugal, that reach out to us, mostly from international relations or law. But for instance, when we start raising awareness in business schools, in schools that are not traditionally linked to diplomacy and international relations, there's suddenly a higher interest in health schools, in schools around the country. So there is a lot of effort that needs to be done to raising awareness, and that's what Farah was also explaining, to be inclusive even within our own countries. One of the things that we can do more is trying to provide more information online, so front load information and make it free. So the Portuguese guide, for instance, is free, the Portuguese version. Other versions of the guide are not free yet. But we are trying to provide as much information as possible for free in advance, in a single, like a one-stop, one-shop type of initiative, so that it's easier for anyone who is interested to understand who to contact, how to contact, where to find information, and that's important. But also, again, Farah was making an excellent point on the different formats, trying to have shorter formats that are intergenerational, working with different age groups, but also making these age groups interact with each other. Making, virtual helps a lot. We're talking that Model UN costs a lot of money, but if we are able, for instance, to make it more dynamic for schools, high schools, universities to organize local Model United Nations first, and with specific resources, and try to generate this movement locally, then of course it's not as expensive to provide that boost. Of course, Model United Nations are also linked to a lot of traveling and the international exposure, which virtual can help, but the in-person experience is of course totally different. And there needs to be a lot of effort, also the financial effort from the participants. But I wouldn't want also to highlight that a lot can also be done at the local level to provide schools and other NGOs, different civil society organizations, with the tools to be able to organize their own initiatives on the ground as well. And that's it on my side.
Thank you very much. Again, I think what's really becoming apparent to me is all of you are speaking with such depth on such linked topics. It really makes me understand how broad MUN can really hit on every aspect. We have quite a few questions, actually. Unfortunately, Jonas, who had his hand up, has just left the call. He just texted me to say he wouldn't be able to. We have a question from Maria Reed on how can UN associations and youth associations help in bringing such initiatives and knowledge more available regionally? And what do you think the challenges could be met whilst trying to do so? I'm going to maybe just point to a particular speaker I feel this revolves around, so that we can get through a few more questions. So maybe Farah, I'll ask a particular question to you, or maybe the specificities on UN associations and youth associations. I guess anyone can answer that. And then we have another question that I came individually on the chapter of youth in the Summit of the Future. So Maha, I'll ask you that full question just afterwards, but maybe Farah, just quickly to you on what can UN associations do?
Yeah. And of course, Bill, being part of the World Federation of UNAs, can also speak to this at a 36,000 foot view. But as we speak about UNA USA, one example, or other UN associations, we are comprised of more than 200 chapters. And I think that, so about 123 are on campuses, and then the rest are community chapters, so based in counties, towns, cities, etc. And I mention this because we also have regions. So as we think about, we have 11 regions within UNA USA, and the more that we are trying to decentralize, if you will, Vitorino, you were talking about localizing, etc. It is, I think, really effective once those resources are had or shared. So we are trying to use our regional representatives who are part of our national council to first train them. If they haven't had the experience of Model UN, to train them so that they in turn can, hopefully utilize the trickle down effect where they can empower chapter leaders in that particular region. I will say that, again, there are so many Model UN clubs. We haven't even scratched the surface from a UNA USA standpoint, and we're trying this new intentional strategy of connecting, but there are people already there. It's a matter of finding them. There's not one massive, and you all can correct me unless there's a secret source, but there's not one massive Rolodex. And that's something that, we can look at our country, we can look at the US and try to define or find under the rocks, which Model UN clubs are there, and try to match make them with UNA chapters. Because again, it's not about competition. We're like-minded organizations, and the idea is from there to try to build up as far as locality. So can we have a citywide Model UN conference? Can we find resources from our community chapters, which may be more connected to, local governments, et cetera, to provide sponsorships and scholarships. So I think it's a very diverse. I'll just say lastly that there's no one turnkey path, and I think that's really important. And I don't think that there necessarily should be, because again, we're trying to host or facilitate or organize conferences based on that particular community.
Thank you very much. Bill, is there anything you particularly want to add from a World Federation perspective?
Just quickly, that to address the regional issue, we sometimes organize Model UNs that are regional in nature, in the sense that for instance, we organized one in Brazil that was targeted to the countries around Brazil. And so one of the advantages to that, again, going to the issue of accessibility, is sometimes the countries around the country where you're organizing a regional conference, it's easier for them to travel, it's less costly, and so forth, as opposed to having them travel to, let's say, the United States. So these regional conferences is one tool we have of helping to make this more accessible. And it's going beyond just having a conference in a particular city. It's marketed as a regional conference where we try to draw students from the countries that are surrounding a particular country. So that's one way that we use regional conferences.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned, we have a question that was sent to me on the chapter of youth in the Summit of the Future. And so, Maha, I want to ask you a bit more about the Summit of the Future. I think you said the third of 4 conferences that are really there to set up sort of the future of the UN agenda. What is the role that you think, obviously youth in general, but Model UN think could be helpful in helping set the agenda, frame the agenda in any ways, really?
I mean, I think realistically, of course, the Pact for the Future, which will be adopted by world leaders when they come to the summit and the dates are 22nd and 23rd of September, is an intergovernmental negotiated process. Mm-hmm. So it will be member states that will negotiate the Pact for the Future. So the zero draft starts in January, and it is actually now being built. I think young people and civil society organizations, what we have heard and what we have been also suggesting to them is to actually have any impact on anything that is negotiated at the UN. The place to start is not at the UN. Mm-hmm. You need to start with the government where you are. So engage where you are with the governments that will be negotiating with other governments. That's one entry point. The second one is, of course, once they start engaging, like at the Civil Society Conference, where we are working with the co-sponsors, the co-facilitators and others, is that's another process where civil society comes and advocates for their point of view and saying, there's no reference enough in the Pact for the Future about civil society, about youth, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole chapter in the summit that is called Youth and Future Generations. And I think this is where, and of course there's, as I mentioned, there's innovation, science, technology, AI, all of that. These are other chapters of the 5 chapters, and cross-cutting are gender and human rights. So these are the key parts of the plan that will be included in the Summit of the Future. But there's also the Digital Compact. There are also other things that our common agenda includes, and there are resources for those. If you go and Google Our Common Agenda, the report of the Secretary General, there are 11 policy papers that the UN system has presented as the intellectual contribution of the UN system on those issues, including the UN 2.0, a new agenda for peace. So all of these are resources that we have available on our website, which is something that is important for people who are interested to go and look at those and see then with us how we can move this forward. And the other question, I think when we noted that many people, when I ask them, why do you participate in a Model UN, or why are you interested? Of course, there are those who have tried it once, loved it, want to meet other people, and they find it useful intellectually, etc. But many of them will say, because I want to have it on my CV. It will help my university application. And in some cases, my university gives me credit for participating in a Model UN. So I think when we think about that, then how do you want to promote more simulations and more opportunities is to think of the education process. And I think this is where how many of the universities are willing to facilitate, give credit, but also how much do they let people know that, you know, having an MUN participation on your CV will help your opportunities for acceptance in the course you want to study or in job in the future. So these are kinds of things that help promote MUNs around the world.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind if I just drill down on that? Would you say that that is a byproduct of maybe MUN being a privilege rather than necessarily something that people have widespread access to? Would you, let's say you ask that question again, you know, are there certain answers you wish you heard more that people said, why do you participate in MUN?
I mean, I mentioned those because they are easy to fix, because that's something, I mean, the biggest growth in Model UN that we have seen, and I think Bill can confirm or say I'm wrong, was in China.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason it happened in China is many Chinese graduates from school apply for American universities. And this is where they were given the notion, if you add MUN on your CV, then your chances of being accepted at these universities will improve, because also your language skill will have been seen as better. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that I would like to see people say we participate because we want to understand how the UN works, not necessarily because we want to work in the UN, but because we want to improve our understanding of the international multilateral system and why is it working or why it isn't working.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. I think that speaks a lot to there need to be different types of MUNs, not all sort of one standard version. And Vitorino, because there hasn't been a question designed for you, I want to almost yield on from what Maher said. Let's say I'm a conference in Lisbon, and we have discussed about the Summit of the Future, and we as an MUN society are talking to you and saying, we want you, the Portuguese permanent mission to the UN, to say this when the negotiations are happening about the Pact for the Future. You know, what would be your response? How do you want MUN societies to engage with you, in this case, as a government?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And so specifically for the Pact for the Future, sorry, there's different ways for different organizations to contribute and to feed into these intergovernmental negotiations. One is, so any organization, meaning member states and civil society and all the stakeholders alike, can send written inputs to the co-facilitators by until the end of the year, so the 31st of December. And on the website of the Summit of the Future, I believe it's not yet available, but it will be made available for an upload. And all of these inputs will be made, to our understanding, public. So you will be able to see what different member states want for the Summit of the Future, what different organizations want for the Summit of the Future. The expectation, because this process of the Summit of the Future, our common agenda, has been there for a while, is that hundreds and hundreds of inputs will be received. So to process all of that will be challenging, but at the same time, it's open and inclusive. The second thing is that there's multiple events that are that different organizations are setting up, are organizing, with the involvement of only civil society or with member states, where we've been challenged to think about specific topics. These are in-person events here in New York, but also virtual events. And we've been challenged as delegations to go literally to any group of friends, any organization that has an interest with regards to the future. You can really imagine the number of invitations that we receive every week. And we try to engage in as many as possible, to understand specifically what are priorities that we can take into account in our negotiations. And then, as Maher was mentioning, there will be a zero draft of the let's call it the resolution, the Pact for the Future. It will be a resolution in the end, in the beginning of the year, on the basis of all these inputs drafted by the co-facilitators that are currently Germany and Namibia. And all member states will engage with language proposals. But I understand that during the negotiations, which will span most likely from January until September, until the adoption of the pact in the summit, there will be different ways to raise awareness for topics. One, as mentioned by Maher, is the civil society conference in Nairobi in May, which will definitely be a milestone in this whole process. But of course, there's different conferences being organized with the SEEDS conference, the LLDC conference, different UN processes that are taking place, and civil society is also organizing events and inviting member states to listen in, to chip in, and to discuss views which can influence the outcome document of this process.
Fantastic. So it sounds like you don't want me to just spam your email repeatedly with suggestions then.
You can.
No, of course not. Well, look, this has been an absolutely incredible discussion, and I think the amount of comments we've had on the meeting chat saying so really speaks to this being such an exciting depth of knowledge and resources. I do want to give you the chance for a short, and I mean short, 30 seconds. I know we have other things across there today. Sort of closing remarks, maybe focusing a little bit on a simple question, which is, what are you most hopeful for when it comes to youth engagement at the UN or even internationally? So I want to start maybe with Bill. So we've got Bill, Farah, Maha, and then Vitorino. Or Maha, do you have to leave soon maybe?
I do.
Okay, maybe if you start yourself, just a small 30 seconds if you'd like. What are you hopeful for?
I think I'm hopeful that young people recognize how much power they have that they don't really appreciate. Today, they are more connected. They are the largest number of young people in the planet we've ever had. And if you think you're too small to make a difference, imagine sleeping with a mosquito. This is an African proverb. Try sleeping with a mosquito in a room and see how effective the mosquito is. So you don't have to be annoying, but be critical and know what you want and go out and get it.
Thank you so much, Maher. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bill, back to you. You're muted, Bill.
I think we've already seen for a number of years now how youth are becoming much more of a priority for the UN system to become a part of the decision-making process in many, many different ways. So I hope that I know this trend will continue, which is very gratifying. And I hope that this focus on Model UN will increase the participation of youth and also build their capacity to participate in international affairs. So I'm very hopeful from what I see now and where I think it is going. So
thank you very much, Bill. Farah?
Yeah, can I just say ditto?
Yeah, you can if you want, but
no, again, I'm representing, and I always like to mention that I am that average person that was interested in multilateralism, etc. I did have an unusual upbringing in terms of how many countries I lived in, but I think that that drives the passion that I've seen in youth. We are an organization that has more than 16,000 youth who obviously care about what's happening in the world. And I think that the more that we can provide resources, access, connect them, the better our world is for it. I mean, it sounds cliche, but it's so true. And I hope that these types of conversations continue where there's some meaningful and tangible action that can be taken. Thank you again.
Thank you. And last but not least, on behalf of all of the member states of the United Nations, no, just Portugal, please. I'm not putting that position. Vitorino.
Thank you. No pressure. No, just to echo, of course, everyone, every colleague, and to reflect on this idea that engaging in multilateralism, engaging through model UNs, is more than just reflecting a passion or doing something that we enjoy. It's also an investment, and it's an investment in our careers, our UN system in general. So of course, it's a logical decision for any member state to support model UNs and to continue doing so as much as possible over the next years.
Thank you so much. And from our perspective, MUN Across Borders, we will be doing our absolute best to support discussions like these. We will be running our annual MUN Summit, hopefully in collaboration with some very important organizations, next March 18th. So please keep your eyes out for that and continue to follow us, follow all of these wonderful organizations and their perspectives, and wishing you the absolute best with all of your initiatives. You are empowered. We are always here to help you. And we look forward to working with you in the future. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the morning, afternoon, evening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.